Let us pray. Almighty God, we willingly acknowledge you as the Supreme Being, most gracious and most merciful. Look down, we beseech you, on us who are members of this Senate, and deign to assist us in the duties that we have to perform on behalf of our beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago. Open our eyes to see the truth and help us to accept it with all its implications into our lives. Direct us, O Lord, in our deliberations so that setting aside private interests, unwholesome prejudices, and personal affections, we may treat all matters set before us with honesty, courage, and conviction. Through all we say and do in this Senate, may we give glory and honor to your holy name, inspire confidence in our fellow citizens, and make a positive contribution to the peace and prosperity of our nation. Amen.
Oath or affirmation, announcements by the Vice President.
Honorable Senators, I have granted leave of absence to Senator the Honorable Paula Gopi-Schoon, who is out of the country, and to Senator Sophia Choate SC, who is ill. Honorable Senators, I have received the following correspondence from Her Excellency the Acting President, Christine Kangaloo. The Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, by Her Excellency Christine Kangaloo, Acting President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, to Mr. Ndali Young. Whereas Senator the Honorable Paula Gopi-Schoon is incapable of performing her duties as a senator by reason of her absence from Trinidad and Tobago, now therefore I, Christine Kangaloo, Acting President as aforesaid, acting in accordance with the advice of the Prime Minister in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(a) and Section 44(4)(a) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Ndali Young, to be a member of the Senate temporarily with effect from the 10th of December 2019 and continuing during the absence from Trinidad and Tobago of the said Senator, the Honorable Paula Gopi-Schoon, given under my hand and the seal of the Acting President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the Office of the President, St. Anne's, this 9th day of December 2019. To Ms. Zola Phillips, whereas Senator Sophia Choate is incapable of performing her duties as a senator by reason of illness, now therefore I, Christine Kangaloo, Acting President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(b) and Section 44(4)(c) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Zola Phillips, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 10th of December 2019 and continuing during the absence of Senator Sophia K. Choate by reason of illness, given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the Office of the President, St. Anne's, this 10th day of December 2019. Honorable Senators, Senators are required to take the oath.
I, Ndali Young, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do solemnly affirm that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities of the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
I, Zola Phillips, having been appointed a Member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago upon which I am about to enter.
Bills brought from the House of Representatives. The Finance Bill 2019 in the name of the Minister of Finance.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Mr. Vice President, in accordance with Standing Order 62(1)B, I beg to move that the next stage of the Finance Bill 2019 be taken later into proceedings. Thank you.
Honourable Senators, the question is that the next stage of the bill be taken later in the proceedings. Those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. The next stage of the Finance Bill 2019 will be taken later in the proceedings.
Petitions, papers.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Mr. Vice President, I have the honour to lay the following papers as listed on the supplemental order paper and the second supplemental order paper in the name of the Minister of Finance. The ministerial report response of the Ministry of Finance to the sixth report of the Joint Select Committee on Finance and Legal Affairs on an inquiry into the implementation of the new public procurement system and the Financial Obligations Amendment Regulations 2019. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to lay the following paper as listed on the supplemental order paper in my name. The delegation report on the 64th Commonwealth Parliamentary Conference held in Kampala, Uganda from September 22nd to the 29th, 2019.
Acting Leader of Government Business.
Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to lay the following papers as listed on the supplemental order paper in the name of the Minister of Housing and Urban Development and in my name. The ministerial response of the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development to the 17th report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee on an examination into the expenditure and internal controls of the East Port of Spain Development Company Limited, and the ministerial response of the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries to the 20th report of the Public Accounts Enterprises Committee on the examination of the audited accounts, balance sheets and other financial statements of the Palo Seco Agricultural Enterprises Limited for the financial years 2012 to 2017. I thank you.
Urgent questions.
President, I crave your indulgence. The two urgent questions are directed to the Honorable Minister of Finance. He's on his way, and I'm asking that these two questions be stood down. I expect him here in a few minutes. Thank you.
Honorable Senators, this item on the order paper will be stood down until the arrival of the Minister of Finance, to whom the questions are directed.
Questions on notice, questions for oral answer.
Acting Leader of Government Business.
Mr. Vice President, there are three questions on notice for response today, and the government will be responding to all three questions.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Question number 16 to the Minister of Planning and Development.
Minister of Planning and Development.
Mr. Vice President, I rise to respond to this question on behalf of the Minister of Planning and Development. I thank the Senator for the question. Mr. Vice President, in answer to the question, the EMA is aware of this particular project. It was a project for which a CEC was applied for, and CEC number 4096 of 2014 was issued to O2 Park, and that CEC was to cut and grade with a gradient of 1 to 4 an area behind the area occupied by O2 for the purpose of slope stabilization. So in response to the question, the project has been approved, a CEC has been issued, the EMA is aware of the project, and the project is to do work relating to slope stabilization at the site occupied by the O2 Park.
Mark, supplemental.
Yes. May I ask the Honourable Minister, through you, Mr. Vice President, whether there has been any breaches or violation of this CEC granted to this particular developer?
Acting Leader of
Mr.
Government
Vice
Business.
President, in April 2015, the holder of the CEC indicated to the EMA that it intended to seek certain modifications of the CEC, but to this date, no modification has been sought. However, in April 2019, there was a newspaper report relating to the observation of someone, a member of the public, who had been in the area, and the report dealt with what appeared to be significant slippage on the site. And upon investigation, the EMA determined, in consultation with the occupant of O2 Park, that there had been a landslide in the area, and the area was particularly vulnerable to landslides because of the absence of vegetation, and the occupant had taken steps to deal with the slippage that occurred. Some of the material had been removed. In fact, Mr. Vice President, I should have said from the outset that the O2 Park is under the jurisdiction of the Chaguaramas Development Authority, for which the Minister of Planning and Development is the line minister, and the O2 Park operates under the powers of the Chaguaramas Development Authority. The material was removed and in fact used by the CDA in some roadworks, and what the occupant is dealing with down there is this issue of land slippage and the need to control what is happening on the slope. Thank you.
Next question, Senator Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Question number 17 to the Attorney General.
Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, on March 8, 2019, Senator the Honorable Jennifer Batiste Primus, Minister of Labour and Small Enterprises Development, laid in Parliament a policy paper entitled A National Workplace Policy on Sexual Harassment in Trinidad and Tobago. This policy treats with, among other things, sexual harassment of migrant workers. Since the policy states that any worker or employee can be a perpetrator or a victim of sexual harassment which may occur, The government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago takes all allegations of sexual harassment seriously and is committed to providing information, resources, and clear direction to all members of staff and stakeholders, both internally and externally, so that together we can help prevent and address this conduct. All persons in Trinidad and Tobago, all members of staff in every workplace are required to treat others with dignity, courtesy, and respect. Sexual harassment is any physical, verbal, or non-verbal conduct of a sexual nature and other conduct affecting the dignity of the individual, which is unwelcomed, unreasonable, and offensive to the recipient. And where a person's rejection of or submission to such conduct is used explicitly or implicitly as the basis for a decision which affects that person's job, it is specific and a serious form of harassment which can lead to a hostile work environment. All employees have the same rights and responsibilities in relation to sexual harassment. Accordingly, as Attorney General, I established a working committee to draft legislation to treat specifically with sexual harassment, and the first meeting was in fact held on November 13th, 2019, with the Attorney General's Office, Chairman of the Equal Opportunities Commission, representatives of Gender and Child Affairs, the Office of the Prime Minister, Law Reform Commission, Ministry of Labour and Small Enterprises, and the Trinidad and Tobago Coalition Against Domestic Violence, as well as several representatives of other NGOs, including the Trinidad and Tobago Coalition Against Domestic Violence subset representatives, at our offices at the Ministry of the Attorney General. The Working Committee aims to complete the draft legislation in line with the National Workplace Policy on sexual harassment for key stakeholder review and comment in the shortest period of time and with a view to introduction in this 5th session of the Parliament. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Mark.
Mr. Vice President, can I ask the Attorney General whether there's an inextricable relationship between the Minister of Labour and the Attorney General in promoting this particular matter of sexual harassment, since the original policy was presented by the Honourable Minister of Labour on sexual harassment. So whether there's a working relationship between the two parties.
Attorney General.
Thank the Honourable Senator for the question. Yes, of course, there is a combined effort approach, policy prescription having been provided by the Ministry, and a matter of serious moment was the laying of this policy. And my colleague, the Honourable Minister of Labour, has done yeoman service to the cause to ensure that this scourge is dealt with in a very conclusive and broad-based point. I invite all senators to reflect upon that excellent policy work that came. The writing of legislation is the Office of the Attorney General. We didn't want to approach this without the stakeholders at the table at the same time. So we've brought the NGOs onto the table. I can tell you that we've in fact already settled upon the formula of law. We've looked at the model precedents. We've looked at CARICOM jurisdictions in particular. We have a first draft of the legislation up already. I expect, all things being equal, over this short break to pair over Christmas, to in fact be in a place to complete the work in rapid form. My ambition is to ensure that we have legislation here as quickly as possible, and hopefully as soon as by January, all things being equal. We've obviated the need for drafting and then send out, etc., by bringing all of the persons and representatives on the table. And yes, it is the Minister of Labour who took such passion in this product to ensure that it was driven the way it has been driven, and that is why we have representation from that ministry sitting on the drafting team as well.
Senator Mark.
Attorney General, can you inform this Senate what legal and or other options are available to migrant workers, particularly female migrant workers, who might be exposed to unnecessary and aggressive sexual harassment by persons in this society? What are the options available?
Senator Mark, I won't allow that question. Next question.
Okay. Can I ask the Honorable Attorney General to indicate, I know he said it would be as soon as possible, but how many consultations would be held by the Attorney General prior to the formal drafting of the legislation to be brought to Parliament for consideration?
Attorney General.
Mr. Vice President, the Ministry of Labour has already done a very wide scope consultation process which has captured all of the policy. The stakeholders, in fact, have commended the policy. They say, look, you are spot on. It actually relates to something the Honourable Senator mentioned a little while ago by way of a proposed supplemental question. There are two forms in the policy which are driven here, which come from the stakeholding. There are two avenues of address immediately available, obviously under the Industrial Relations Formula, Ministry of Labour combination, and then the Equal Opportunities Tribunal. All workers are workers, whether they're migrant workers, local workers, international workers, they fit into the same bracket and therefore have the same rights because they're subjected to the Trinidad and Tobago jurisprudence. So there's been an open agreement that the formula that has been proposed by my colleague, the Minister of Labour, is a good working formula. The question right now is which approach we take, and that affects the consultation. The approach appears to be a bifurcation between the Industrial Court and the Equal Opportunities Court, because you really want to go with something that's working already, not necessarily having to reinvent the wheel. So we expect to get this product out with alacrity. Certainly the consultations will continue in the cycle of production, but we're going to bring this to Parliament as soon as possible. My own personal intention is to pitch for the month of January. Of course, we have yet to have cabinet approval, etc.
Attorney General, could you indicate, maybe I didn't hear properly, or it may have slipped me, but can you indicate whether the labor movement, whether it's NATO or FITOM or JTOM, have representation on the working committee dealing with this very important document?
Attorney General.
Sure. They don't have specific representation immediately on this. I'm in another group setting with the entire labor movement. I've invited them to sit on the reforms to the industrial relations cycle. So we've established a working committee. I've just received their nominees to sit on that committee. Having that committee at the AG's office at the same time drafting those laws, one feeds into the other. So we'll certainly be reaching out to them, including them in the formula product that we have as we get this position together. This ties in, Mr. Vice President, with another law which we have just completed. I'm going to propose that it be taken to Cabinet, which is amendments to the Domestic Violence Act. So there are in tandem approaches. I want to remind that this comes after having birthed a family and children division, having put in rules of court, created specialist courts, a child protection unit, a victim protection unit, probation officers. Hundreds of bodies have been hired and put into place and operation. The Commissioner of Police has spoken to the targeted arrangements on that end. The Minister of National Security has done the migration population exercise. So there's a whole host of government agencies and NGOs that are in effect. It ties in with our non-profit organizations law, which marries up the entities that look at this and the work that's going on at the Office of the Prime Minister. This is a whole of government, whole of Trinidad and Tobago approach.
No more supplementals on that. That's it for. Next question, Senator Mark.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question number 18 to the Minister of National Security.
Acting Leader of Government Business.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, the Chief Fire Officer has advised that the cause of the fire at the Scarborough Fire Station was determined to be accidental in nature. I thank you.
Senator Mark.
Can the Honourable Minister indicate the extent of the destruction to the Scarborough Fire Station as a result of this accident?
Acting Leader of Government Business.
Mr. Vice President, I am not in a position to indicate the extent of the damage, except to say that the site has been reviewed by the various agencies, including the OSH agency, and steps have been taken by the Minister of National Security, working with the Permanent Secretary, to have the repairs effected. And as soon as the fire took place, the officers who operated there to service that part of Tobago were relocated to the Crown Point Fire Station and have been operating from there and servicing the area that would have been serviced by the Scarborough Fire Station. Thank you.
Senator Mark.
Mr. Vice President, can the Honorable Minister share with this Senate what was the nature of the accident that you mentioned that caused the fire? What was the nature of the accident?
Acting Leader of Government Business.
Mr. Vice President, I am not seized of anything beyond the declaration of the Chief Fire Officer that the fire was accidental in nature. Thank you.
Senator Mark.
Asking you, Mr. Vice President, for the Honorable Minister to inquire what is the nature of the accident and provide the Senate with his response in writing at the next sitting of the Senate. Can I ask you that?
Mr. Vice President, may I propose that the better approach would be for my friend to file a question on notice, and the government would be happy to respond to that question. Thank you.
That's it, Senator Mark. Honourable Senators, at this point in time, we will revert to item 8 on the order paper, which is urgent questions, as we have the responder to the questions. Senator Mark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. To the Honorable Minister of Finance, in light of claims that some businesses are already refusing to accept the paper-based $100 notes before the demonetization date, can the Minister state what action is being taken by the government to immediately address this problem?
Minister of Finance.
Mr. Vice President, as you know, this question only came to us about an hour ago, and we are still being advised. But what I would say in the interim is that as Minister of Finance, I will ask the Governor of the Central Bank to see what arrangements can be made for merchants who may wish to turn in old notes close to the deadline. But as I said, I'm being advised at this point in time because it's a bit of a complicated matter. But that is the plan, to ask the central bank to see what arrangements can be made for merchants who may wish to turn in large quantities of notes towards the end of the year, towards the 31st of December.
Vice President, can I ask the Honorable Minister whether it is legal or illegal for businesses to bluntly refuse legal tender notes that are rendered or that are offered in exchange for services? Can businesses automatically, whimsically refuse to accept the $100 notes, and whether that is legal in TNT? Can you advise us on this?
Minister of Finance.
Yes. Firstly, I would say the $100 bill, the existing cloth paper note, is legal tender and will be legal tender until the 31st of December 2019. The issue is whether in a private transaction, because it's a transaction between two private parties, a private individual, a private company, or another private individual, whether you can compel somebody to take a particular note. For example, a person may not have change for that note. So that I am being advised, and I think I would receive proper legal advice later in the afternoon. I have already engaged 2 senior counsels to tell me what is the practice in other countries where you had demonetization. But I want to stress, it is a private transaction between a private individual and another private individual or private company. And we have to look at that and see exactly. And of course, the Attorney General will be the legal advisor on this, the legal advisor to the government on this matter. So I don't want to step out of my crease and give a definitive answer at this point in time. But what I would say is that I will request the governor to see whether special arrangements can be made for merchants who may have large quantities of the old bills in their possession that they would wish to turn in towards the end of the year.
Senator Mark.
Mr. Vice President, through you to the Honorable Minister. Honorable Minister, what happens to citizens who may have large stash of cash in terms of 100 notes after the 31st of December? Can you explain to this Honorable House what options would be available to those citizens after the deadline date? Are these 100 notes therefore legal tender after the 31st, or are they of no value after the 31st of December 2019?
Minister of Finance.
Sure, Senator Mark, your question was about merchants accepting $100 bills. You have now changed the question to people who may have $100 bills in their possession. This is one of the problems with urgent questions, which it's a device that you came up with in another incarnation, where you come at someone with a question an hour before and then come with supplementaries that bear no relationship to the original question. I can say, I will repeat that the $100 bill, the paper bill, will be legal tender up to midnight on the 31st of December 2019. And I just said that. So for you to ask me that question twice, as if I didn't say that, is a little puzzling.
Senator Mark, next urgent question.
I know we are tired somewhat, yeah? So I understand. Mr. Vice President, may I address you? To the Honorable Minister of Finance. Having regard to the $10,000 limit imposed by banks in the redemption of $100 notes and the impact this would have on Muslim citizens seeking to redeem large sums of $100 bills, what arrangements are being made to facilitate this community?
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, the amendments to the Central Bank Act, the insertion of the new Section 27A, provide for
27A or 37?
27A, the new 27A. The insertion of the new 27A in the Central Bank Act makes provision for the redemption of notes. The banks have know your customer arrangements in place. They have had know your customer arrangements in place for years as a result of the enactment of the Financial Intelligence Unit Act way back in 2009, and it was then amended in 2010, 2011, and so on, as the prominence of the Financial Action Task Force and the anti-money laundering provisions began to kick in, and now we have the Global Forum and the EU Council of Ministers looking at how we deal with finances and transactions and wire transfers and cash transactions and so on. So there have been arrangements in the banks for years with respect to transactions. Prior to Monday, a large transaction was $90,000 or more. It is now $50,000 or more. For casinos, they had a special regime. Prior to Monday, a large transaction in a casino was $18,000 or more. It's now $10,000 or more. What the commercial banks have chosen to do with the non-objection of the central bank is for persons who have no bank account whatsoever. They have no banking record. They've never banked. They're called the unbanked. They have limited the change of the note from the old note to the current note to the new polymer to a maximum of $10,000 per transaction. Persons who may have more than that.
Minister, time for responding to the urgent question.
I could deal with it in a supplemental.
Senator Mark, supplemental.
Can I ask the Honorable Minister, given the growing concern by a very significant section of the national community, does the government intend to take any measures, including reviewing this 14-day deadline, that is the 31st of December, in order to address some of those concerns that I have mentioned?
Minister of Finance.
Yes, and let me now address the point because it's relevant to the supplemental. So that persons who are unbanked, who have more than $10,000 per transaction, simply go to the central bank. The central bank will change the money for them. They would simply have to fill out the normal forms, produce a form of identification, produce a proof of address like a utility bill, and fill out a source of funds form. So if someone walks in with $2 million in cash, they would have to go through the normal know your customer procedures at the central bank. So the central bank is the area where persons of the Muslim faith can go to if they have large amounts of cash that they wish to redeem. With respect to the notice is actually from the 9th of December to the 31st of December. That's a little more than 14 days in the calendar. So that's the deadline at this point in time. The plan is to stick to that deadline, but the government has given itself the flexibility in the legislation to extend the date of cancellation if necessary. But at this point in time, the plan is to stick to the deadline.
Honourable Senators, the time for urgent questions has ended.
Requests for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on definite matters of urgent public importance.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. In accordance with Standing Order 16.2, I hereby seek your leave to move the adjournment of the Senate for the purpose of discussing a definite matter of urgent public importance, namely the failure of the government to protect the public health of the citizenry by providing sufficient security and protection from the spread of the influenza virus, which has led to the death of 32 persons to date. The matter is definite as it pertains specifically to the obligation of the state to fulfill measures in protecting the health of the citizenry by ensuring adequate public health infrastructure and preventing the spread of communicable diseases. The matter is urgent as there has been an alarming rate of influenza-related fatalities within the last 3 months, which in comparison to the flu-related deaths for 2018 represents an increase of 300% in deaths. The matter is of public importance as the failure of the government to take urgent action in the protection of its citizens may result in further deaths, which would invariably escalate the mortality rate and call into question the failure of the government to provide quality health care. I thank you for your consideration of this critically important matter, Mr. Vice President.
Honorable Senators, I have considered the motion of the Senator, and I am not satisfied that this matter as presented qualifies under this standing order.
Public business, government business, bills, second reading.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I beg to move that a bill entitled An Act to Provide for the Imposition or Variation of Certain Duties and Taxes and to introduce provisions of a fiscal nature and for related matters be now read a second time. Mr. Vice President, before us this afternoon is the Finance Bill 2019, which is aimed at putting in place the fiscal measures and related matters that were pronounced in the 2020 budget statement in the other place on October 7, 2019. Mr. Vice President, Clause 1 of the bill is self-explanatory and merely deals with the short title of the bill, which is cited as Finance Act 2019. At the outset, Mr. Vice President, I would say that Clause 9 is the commencement provision containing the date from which the provisions of the Act will come into force. By virtue of that provision, all the clauses except for Clause 4K will come into operation on January 1, 2020. Clause 4K provides for consequential amendments to the Corporation Tax Act, Chapter 7502, which are necessary to implement the Insurance Act of 2018. It deals, in effect, with how insurance companies are to be taxed under the new Act, and I will go into more detail on that provision later in my presentation, Mr. Vice President. But in respect of the coming into force of that provision, you will recall, Mr. Vice President, that the Insurance Act comes into force on proclamation by the President. So what we are seeking to do in Clause 9 is to allow the President to also proclaim this particular amendment so that they will come into force at the same time as the insurance bill will come into force. So moving on to the other provisions of the legislation, Mr. Vice President, I will start with the provisions that impact the energy sector. There are three provisions which deal with the energy sector that seek to address incentives relative to exploration, production, and development in the energy sector. The first deals with loss relief, and those amendments are to be found in clauses 3A and 3B of the bill, which seeks to amend the Income Tax Act, Chapter 7501, to address the issue of loss relief that can be claimed by companies engaged in exploration, production, and development of oil and gas in Trinidad and Tobago. Under the provision as currently obtains, all persons involved in trade or business are entitled, when they incur a loss in a particular year that they cannot offset against the profits of that year, to carry those losses forward and to write it off against future profits without limitation. What we are proposing in the current bill is that in respect of energy companies, their ability to write off the loss will be limited to 75% of the profits of the year, which will ensure that in every year that an energy company generates profits, it will be required to pay some tax to the government of Trinidad and Tobago, as opposed to being able to apply all their brought forward losses against the profits of that year. So that is the extent of that amendment. And we expect that measure to provide some revenue to the coffers, which we would not otherwise have received as early as we will receive it when we make the change. That provision, as I indicated, is to come into effect on January 1, 2020. The second provision, which as well deals with the energy sector, is the adjustment of the investment tax credit. The investment tax credit, currently energy companies engage in approved development activity in mature marine and land oil fields that are 25 years or older. So these are people who are trying to secure energy product from aged fields and therefore have to do a little more work to get there. They are entitled to a tax credit of 20% of the qualifying expenditure, and this is deducted against their Supplemental Petroleum Tax. Mr. Vice President, Supplemental Petroleum Tax, pursuant to Part 2 of the Petroleum Taxes Act, Chapter 7504, is a tax that is charged essentially on the gross income, with a couple of exceptions, derived from the disposal of crude oil in accordance with the rates fixed in the 3rd Schedule of the Petroleum Taxes Act. This is computed separately in respect of land operations, marine operations, and marine operations in the deep water. Supplemental petroleum tax applies, it's called loosely a windfall tax, and it applies only at the point where the price of oil equals or exceeds $50 a barrel. And because it kicks in at that point, what happens is there's a kind of a shock to the system of the people involved in this area, because they go from paying no tax at all to paying what can be a substantial amount of tax. And what we want to do is encourage the continued activity and investment of people in this sector, because, as I said, these are people who are seeking to recover oil from fields that are aged, and they have to incur more expenditure to do that. So what we are seeking to do is increase the allowance from 20% to 25% to give them some more leeway in terms of how they can structure their investment, and hopefully in that way encourage further investment in that area. The final provision in respect of energy companies relates to the capital allowance which they are allowed to claim in respect of their activity. Mr. Vice President, Section 17A2 and 24.2 of the Income Tax in Aid of Industry Act, Chapter 8103, currently allows production companies accelerated depreciation of their capital expenditure. Such companies are allowed to fully write off their capital expenditure over 3 years as follows. They are allowed to deduct 50% of the expenditure in year 1, 30% in year 2, and 20% in year 3. And as we would have indicated on prior occasions, what this has done is to cause the companies to create more significant losses than they otherwise would have, and therefore not be contributing taxes to the economy at this point. As we would have indicated previously, when we met with BP about a year or two ago, they had indicated that the result of the new regime, which was introduced during the 2010 to 2015 period, they were not expected to pay taxes until 2024. And when the government looked at our situation, we determined that was not a sustainable position. The country needs the revenue from the energy sector, and therefore what we are seeking to do is revise the capital allowance structure to spread it over a longer period, and therefore increase the likelihood of the energy companies being able to contribute to the coffers as we go forward. So what we are proposing to do is to introduce a fixed rate allowance of 20% per year for 5 years for all energy companies in respect of tangible and intangible expenses incurred on or after the 1st of January 2020. Any expenditure incurred before that date will continue to attract allowances under the current existing regime. Mr. Vice President, I now turn to fiscal measures for the non-energy sector. And the first one I will deal with is promotional expenses, which we are seeking to amend by clauses 4A, B, and C of the bill, which is seeking to amend Chapter 7502 to extend the promotional allowance to first-time exports to CARICOM countries. We currently have a promotional allowance. It applies on the export of goods in commercial quantities, the export of agricultural produce in commercial quantities, and the export of what I would loosely call construction services. So architectural and quantitative and those kinds of services related to the building, the construction industry. The expenditure to promote the export of these goods and services currently attracts a promotional allowance of 150% of the expense actually incurred, but only applies if the export is to a non-CARICOM country. What we are seeking to do is encourage greater activity within the CARICOM sphere, promote exports in those areas, so we are extending the promotional allowance to first-time exports to CARICOM countries. And that is the extent of the amendment to the promotional allowance. We are also seeking to provide greater relief to the creative and other industries where they are entitled at this point in time to certain allowances, but we are increasing the extent of the allowance. So, Mr. Vice President, it is recognized that amongst the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, there exists considerable local talent. In recognition of these talents and in an effort to promote the development of future talent, Clause 4 seeks to provide further incentive for the development of this talent consistent with Theme 1 of our Vision 2030, putting people first, nurturing our greatest asset. Sections 10G, 10I, 10J, 10K, and 10L of the Corporation Tax Act all grant relief in respect of expenditure incurred in relation to local talent as follows. 10G provides incentives in respect of expenditure on artistic work, both visual artistic and performing artistic work. Section 10I provides incentives in respect of the promotion and sponsorship of sporting activities, events, and local sportsmen. Section 10J provides relief in respect of sponsorship of audio, visual, or video productions for education, entertainment, or promotion of culture. Section 10K provides relief to production companies for that similar type of activity, the creation of audio, visual, and video production for entertainment, education, or promotion of culture. And Section 10Q provides incentives in respect of the promotion of the fashion industry. Anyone who incurs expenditure in any of these items may currently claim either the actual expenditure up to $3 million, or in respect of the fashion industry and production companies, 150% of the actual expenditure, again, up to a maximum of $3 million. What we are seeking to do is increase that maximum to $6 million in respect of each category. Madam Speaker, there's a cap on, Mr. Vice President, I'm sorry, there's a cap on the total amount of expenditure that can be claimed by a company in respect of these allowances. Section 10L, in respect of which you will also see an amendment in the bill, provides that for the purposes of ascertaining the chargeable profits of a company for the year of income, the aggregate allowance that may be claimed in respect of artistic work, sporting activities, sponsorship of audio and visual productions, and the promotion of the fashion industry shall not exceed in aggregate $3 million. We are seeking to increase that aggregate to $6 million, and this is per annum. There's also an amendment to Section 10L2, which deals specifically with production companies, because you may recall that I just mentioned that a production company that is producing local videos, audios for promotion of entertainment and education and culture is entitled in its own right to claim a deduction of 150% of its expenditure up to $6 million. So if over and above that, that production company seeks to provide support in the other areas, visual or performing arts or fashion or these other areas, they are entitled to a further deduction of currently up to $2 million. We are seeking to increase that to $4 million. So a production company may claim $6 million in respect of its own production, and then $4 million in respect of any sponsorship that it provides to other companies for local art, local sports, and so on. So those are the amendments in respect of production. And Mr. Vice President, it is important to note that this is an area, the area of promotion of local talent is an area that the government sees as an important area for promotion and expansion and diversification. We have seen movement, we have seen traction in the initiatives we have taken, and a lot of those initiatives are sponsored by government expenditure. What this is seeking to do is to bring the private sector into that area and give them, increase the incentive that they have to also get involved in sponsoring of this very worthwhile activity. Mr. Vice President, I move now to the provision dealing with solar water heating equipment, which is to be found in Clause 3C of the bill. This provision proposes to increase the tax credit available to persons who purchase solar water heating equipment for household use. Currently, Section 48M of the Income Tax Act, Chapter 7501, allows such persons, that is a person who purchases solar equipment for household use, to claim 25% against his tax, to claim a tax credit of 25% of the cost incurred up to a maximum of $10,000. That has gathered some interest, and I've been advised that approximately 12,000 people have so far taken advantage of that provision. We are seeking to accelerate the conversion of Trinidadians and Tobagonians from the traditional source of electricity to these more environmentally friendly sources, and we are seeking to do that in this instance by increasing the tax credit from 25% of the expenditure to 100% of the expenditure, but maintaining the limit of $10,000, which when we look at the landscape, we think that's reasonable for a household. So you will now be able to get a tax credit, not a tax deduction, but a tax credit, which is much more beneficial, and I will explain to you why for those of you who aren't tax people, of 100% of the expenditure. Now, I will give you an example. Let's say you earn $1,000 a month or a year. If you are getting a tax deduction for that, you deduct the let's say you pay $100 for your water heater, you deduct $100 from your $900, and you pay tax at 25% on $900. If you are getting a tax credit, you apply the 25% on the $1,000, end up with $250, and then deduct the $100 from the $250. So you get a much more significant benefit when you get a tax credit rather than a tax deduction. And what we are doing here is increasing the size of the tax credit to which you're entitled. So we are really hoping that this spurs more people to look to solar panel energy for their houses. I would say, Mr. Vice President, that this measure is set against CARICOM's 47% target for power generation from renewables by 2027 and conforms with the view that given the enormous scales of resources in the region, renewable energy should be contributing more to the region's energy needs and increasing prospects of energy security. Moreover, this measure also reflects Trinidad and Tobago's own commitment to 10% or 150 megawatts of renewable power generation by 2031, with wind and solar energy being the leading options. So that is the objective. Relief measures. Mr. Vice President, I will first deal with the issue of the personal allowance at airports. Clause 7 of the bill seeks to amend Item 6AA5 of the second schedule of the Customs Act, Chapter 7801, by increasing the duty allowance available to a passenger from $3,000 to $5,000 per annum on goods purchased abroad by the passenger and brought in when entering Trinidad and Tobago, or goods purchased locally in our inbound shops at the ports. It applies to goods purchased for the passenger's personal or household use, or as souvenirs or gifts. This increase in the duty allowance is in addition to those reliefs granted on alcohol, tobacco, cigars, and cigarettes. Mr. Vice President, Cooperative Societies. Clause 8 of the bill amends Section 41(3) of the Cooperative Societies Act, Chapter 8103, by increasing the value of shares and/or interest that a society may transfer to a nominee or legal personal representative of a deceased member from $5,000 to $50,000. Mr. Vice President, this is loosely called a death benefit, and what it allows is for the credit union to pay almost immediately to the beneficiary or legal personal representative of a deceased member an amount which is usually used to cover the cost of funerals, which have become significantly more expensive since this measure was first introduced. The credit union movement has been lobbying for this for quite some time, and we think it is only reasonable in the circumstances to give the relief, so we are moving the death benefit from $5,000 to $50,000. Insurance companies taxation reform. Mr. Vice President, as you are aware, the Insurance Act of 2018 was assented to on June 4th, 2018, and is currently awaiting a date to be fixed for entry into force by the President by proclamation. One of the fundamental changes that was made to that legislation was it removed the requirement for insurance companies to maintain statutory funds for the protection of their policyholders. The change was seen as necessary given that the statutory fund requirement under the existing Insurance Act of 1980, which is computed as a summation of liabilities to Trinidad and Tobago policyholders and reported as such, does not mandate the actual segregation of assets in the fund by class of business in the investment accounting records of the relevant insurance companies. This was seen to be a loophole and did not provide the level of protection to policyholders that we felt was necessary. So Section 83(2) of the Insurance Act of 2018 changes this paradigm by mandating the insurer to maintain and hold adequate assets to support its liabilities to its Trinidad and Tobago policyholders. So having regard to the fact that no statutory fund currently exists, that creates a roll-on impact in the tax area, in the area of taxation of insurance companies, because under the corporation tax as currently crafted, insurance companies are taxed on the profits from their statutory funds. So that what we have decided to do was to remove the connection of taxes statutory fund, because then there's no such thing, and the new methodology will have a minimum marginal impact on the tax assets. So what we are saying is that insurance companies will pay tax on the profits generated from the assets that are held for the protection of their policyholders. And so the change in the tax structure is not significant, but it was essential for the purpose of bringing effect to the insurance legislation. So Clause 4K of the bill is a consequential amendment to the 4th Schedule of the Corporation Tax Act to establish a new methodology for the taxation of life insurance business. Mr. Vice President, the new methodology will ensure a smooth transition to the new Insurance Act, as the existing methods for computation of profits of taxation under paragraphs 3.1 of the 4th Schedule to the Corporation Act will be retained. So we are not significantly changing the method of taxation. The tax position will remain substantially the same as under the Insurance Act of 1980. Insurance companies and the Association of Trinidad and Tobago Insurance Companies, ATIC, have been consulted and have confirmed their understanding of the new methodology and the acceptance of the fact that it will not create difficulties in the transition. And the proposed taxation basis retains the link to the regulatory framework by reference to requirements in the Insurance Act of 2018. Mr. Vice President, in respect of the environmental tire tax, that was introduced a year or two ago, in the budget statement of 2018, we had proposed the implementation of environmental tax of $20 per tire on all tires imported into Trinidad and Tobago. This tax was intended to cover the cost of proper disposal of used tires. Notwithstanding that clear policy position, the measure was inadvertently only imposed tax on used tires and therefore put an unfair burden on persons supplying those tires. The measure was implemented by Finance Act 2017, Act number 15 of 2017, which inter alia amended the Miscellaneous Taxes Act, Chapter 7701, and referenced tariff heading numbers under Section 27D of the Act. In order to address this inconsistent treatment, it is proposed to amend the Miscellaneous Taxes Act to allow the $20 environmental tax to be imposed on all taxes imported into Trinidad and Tobago, and Clause 6, Mr. Vice President, will address that issue. Finally, Mr. Vice President, Clause 2.1 of the bill, Clause 2.1 of the Treasury Bills Act, Chapter 7140, presently permits the minister, in this case the Minister of Finance, to borrow in Trinidad and Tobago by the issue of Treasury bills such sum or sums not exceeding in aggregate 5,000 million Trinidad and Tobago dollars. Mr. Vice President, Section 2.1b of the Act also allows the minister to borrow by issue of Treasury bills such further sum or sums as may be prescribed by resolution of Parliament. Mr. Vice President, you may be aware that a Treasury bill, by its very nature, is a short-term financial instrument purchased by investors and has a maturity period of up to 1 year. In Trinidad and Tobago, Treasury bills are issued by the minister as short-term borrowing for, among other things, government expenditure. Mr. Vice President, you may be aware that Treasury bills are also issued by the minister to be used by the central bank for open market operations for liquidity purpose in the monetary system. The amendment to the Treasury Bills Act is intended to focus on giving the minister some flexibility in respect of short-term borrowing for government expenditure. In this regard, Section 2(1)A of the bill will be amended. Section 2(1)A of the Act is proposed to be amended by Clause 2 of the bill to increase the aggregate amount from 5,000 million TT dollars to 7,000 million TT dollars. This amendment will give the minister flexibility to secure funds at a cheaper and faster rate. Treasury bills are routinely raised in a day speed at interest rates of below 3% for a one-year bill. By comparison, the interest rates on the overdraft is 5%. In fact, the current rate received on Treasury or payable on Treasury bills is 2.2%, which is significantly below the current overdraft rate. So we are seeking to give the Minister of Finance the flexibility to borrow from that source at a cheaper and faster rate rather than other options which are more expensive. So, Mr. Vice President, those, in summary, are the provisions in the bill that is before us. It, by and large, merely seeks to give effect to the measures that we would have raised during the course of the budget debate, and I ask the members of this House to support us in getting this through. I thank you, and I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, I shall now propose a question for debate. The question is that a bill entitled an Act to provide for the imposition or variation of certain duties and taxes and to introduce provisions of a fiscal nature and for related matters be now read a second time. Senator Mark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, we are dealing with an act to provide for the imposition or variation of certain duties and taxes and to introduce provisions of a fiscal nature and for related matters. Because of the number of very critical matters that is contained in this piece of legislation, I will have to, given the time limitation as well, I'll have to confine myself to just a few. I'll want to look at Clause 2. I want to look at the petroleum taxes section, looking at tax credit and capital allowances. I also want to look at Clause 7, briefly on Clause 6 as well, and this matter of solar water heaters that the minister made reference to. Mr. Vice President, we are dealing with the Finance Bill of 2019. And as we know, this bill is supposed to reflect measures contained in the 2019-2020 budget, which required legislative action, and which is what we are dealing with here today, and which are supposed to be effected by a certain date, 31st December, 1st of January. Mr. Vice President, nowhere in the budget speech did the Minister of Finance tell the population that an amendment was coming to the Treasury Bills Act. I read the budget, I contributed to the budget, and nowhere in the budget statement was there any indication to the population that the government was going to amend the Treasury Bills Act. Was that deliberate? Was that deceptive? Was that an attempt to hide information from the population, knowing that a local government election was around the corner? I don't know. All I can tell you is that traditionally, we know that the government has the power in an omnibus legislation or law to bring in whatever they think or deem necessary. But as a mark of respect, they ought to tell the population in advance that they were going to bring an amendment to the Treasury Bills Act. Mr. Vice President, may I remind you, it was in December of 2017 when they ambushed this Parliament. And they did this very same thing that they are doing today. They brought a finance bill, Mr. Vice President. And you know what they did, Mr. Vice President? The government amended the Central Bank Act. Not to cancel notes, as it did last week, but to extend the percentage that they would be able to access in overdraft facilities based on the budget numbers. And they increased it from 15% to 20%. That caused a firestorm in this country. Now, in that same finance bill, they brought an amendment to the Treasury Bills Act. And we moved, Mr. Vice President, from a ceiling of $2 billion to a ceiling of $5 billion. That was in 2017, December. Mr. Vice President, fast forward to 2019. Some 2 years later, we are having in Clause 2 another amendment to the Treasury Bills Act to extend the ceiling from $5 billion or 5,000 million to 7,000 million or 7 billion. And we are told very glibly and loosely and almost flippantly by the Honorable Minister of Finance in the Ministry of Finance that this is to give the minister flexibility to borrow money to pay for their bills. This government has not only crashed the economy, but the government is bankrupt. And what they are doing, they accuse us of running the economy on fumes. Well, I am telling them, they are running the economy on fumes. So, Mr. Vice President, this has implications. The Honorable Minister said that they can get short-term instruments, which is what Treasury bills are about, 90 days, 120 days, 160 days. They are going into the open market, like the central bank, to mop up what is called excess liquidity in the system. And they are going to take from the system $2 billion more. And Mr. Vice President, as you know, there is no more budget next year. Because budget day, as you know, ends the 30th of September. Parliament prorogues and dissolve on the 23rd of September next year. So there's no budget. So they have to go home by calling the elections so we can send them home quickly. Your days are over. The people are fed up with you, Mr. Vice President. So what they are doing now, they are using and abusing the Treasury Bills Act in order to finance, as they did in the local government elections, and they got licks, and I'm telling them now, they will get licks in the 2020 general election. So you all could do what you want. You could go and take $2 billion from the Treasury Bills Act through short-term instruments. That won't help you. Mr. Vice President, you know what the implications of this? They are going to crowd out the private sector. They are going to most likely, Mr. Vice President, we are going to most likely see, Mr. Vice President, a rise in the rate of interest as this almost incompetent, clueless, visionless, intellectually bankrupt government decide to do what, Mr. Vice President? Go into the Treasury Bills Act to get $2 billion. Mr. Vice President, what has been happening to cash flow management in this country? I thought that this Treasury Bill Act and notes, both the Treasury Notes Act and the Treasury Bills Act, would have been instruments utilized by the central bank for what is called open market operations to mop up excess liquidity. But I now realize that the government of Trinidad and Tobago has substituted itself for the central bank. They are now mopping up excess liquidity in the system. That is what they are doing, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, may I advise you, this government has taken the public debt to over $103 billion. You know what is the debt to GDP ratio? Close to 64%. The IMF is predicting if people were to take God out of their thoughts and put back in this clueless and visionless government, they are predicting that by 2022, our debt to GDP ratio will be between 85 to 95%. Because all this government can do is borrow and tax. Borrow and tax. They have no clue as to how to make this economy work. That is why you got a signal. And I want to tell you, it's a message. You got a message. Take it seriously. So, Mr. Vice President, that's the first area of concern to us. This attempt by this government to engage in short-term borrowing to deal with what is called their current expenditure. You know what that is to do to, Mr. Vice President? Pay salaries. They are having difficulty meeting their monthly obligations to civil servants and public officers in this society. So that is why they are going where they are going. Mr. Vice President, may I remind you, there's a monetary report that came out in November. It normally would come out about sometime early November, around the 15th or the 17th. You know what is? You know what was done? And I don't know who to blame. I cast no aspersions. All I can tell you is that accidentally, the central bank report on monetary matters, or what is called the monetary report, did not come out on the time or during the period it was supposed to come out. But you know what? Local elections was at its height. So they didn't want the people and the country to know what was contained in the monetary report. So you know what they did, Mr. Vice President? The monetary report was issued only after leaks took place. Bazodi, Malkadi, Total Bay. Then they put out the monetary report, Mr. Vice President. that was after the normal time it would have been put out. But, Mr. Vice President, it didn't help them because the reality came and the report was published in November, around December rather, sometime late November, early December. But it came after local government elections, Mr. Vice President. And what did that monetary report tell us? I find that the Honorable Minister was very subdued today. Because, you know why, Mr. Vice President? Nothing to report. They are on their way out on the 4th year, into the 5th year, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, may I remind you, we have a few days before the season of goodwill and peace unto all men and women. After that is 9 months, and that will pass with the wink of an eye. And after that is licks, licks, licks. People waiting on you all, man. I want to tell the Minister of Public Utilities, he did a good job in Faizabad. If you see lights, they never had lights and water as they have now, thanks to the Honorable Minister of Public Utilities. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. But you got licks in spite of the lights. Mr. Vice President, you know what happened, Mr. Vice President? The monetary report, which the Honorable Minister of the Ministry of Finance didn't tell us nothing about in terms of the state of this economy. I want to tell the Honorable Vice President, through you, to this Honorable Senate. You know what this report, you know what the report is saying, Mr. Vice President? This monetary report against all the measures that we are dealing with today, you know what it is telling the whole country? Growth is declining. Mr. Vice President, negative growth in 2016, negative growth in 2017, negative growth in 2018, and negative growth in 2019. We are predicting negative growth in 2020. This government, with over $250 billion, would have shrunk our economy by 12% during their 5-year reign. That alone should give them a red card and send them packing. No growth, Mr. Vice President, in the economy. The economy is declining. Drilling is declining. Oil production is falling. Mr. Vice President, may I remind you, if you are not aware, as I'm coming to deal with the petroleum tax credit. Mr. Vice President, do you know that in 2015, when we left office, we had 78,630 barrels of oil. You know, at the end of between January to September 2019, not even the whole of 2019, we're down to 58,793. In 2018, it was 63,000, 71,000. And in 2016, 71. So, Mr. Vice President, our oil production has been declining. Mr. Vice President, oil refining has stopped. And no matter what they tell this country, it is a cardinal sin that this government has committed against this nation by closing down the flagship industry of our country, Petrotrin. And the country will never forget you. Mr. Vice President, may I remind you of a famous statement made by Maya Angelou. She said, people will forget what you say. People will forget what you did. But people will never, ever forget how they made you feel or how they made them feel. And Mr. Vice President, the people of Trinidad and Tobago have begun to tell the government, like Maya Angelou said, how we have felt after 4 years of PNM brutality and punishment and arrogance, Mr. Vice President, insulting the population. You know what, Mr. Vice President? The people have had enough. And not only I am saying that, Mr. Vice President, it is happening in the numbers. Fertilizer production down. Fertilizer exports down. Local cement sales down. Vehicle register declining. Average daily vacancy for jobs falling, Mr. Vice President. All over the country, there is gloom and doom. Gloom and doom, Mr. Vice President, because this economy under this PNM stewardship has not gone anywhere except downhill, Mr. Vice President. So what do they have to tell us? Nothing. What do they have to show? Nothing, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I just want to let you know that when we go to the petroleum taxes clause in this bill, where we have been advised that we are moving from 20% to 25%, may I remind you how this thing came about? The Minister of Finance, Mr. Vice President, in the 2020 budget indicated, and I quote, "I propose to increase the investment tax credit for energy companies from 20% to 25% to stimulate further exploration and development-related investments in the energy sector." And that is being done, Mr. Vice President, by an amendment to the Petroleum Taxes Act, Section 26, subsection 1. That is a section, Mr. Vice President, that speaks to tax credits to be applied to what is called the Supplemental Petroleum Tax liability. Mr. Vice President, a tax credit of 20% of capital expenditure can be had if companies invest in certain activities such as mature field development, enhanced oil recovery. This bill and the measures in it seeking to increase this to 25%. Mr. Vice President, in a situation where oil production is declining and falling, I would like to ask the Minister of Finance, in the Ministry of Finance, this is a minuscule increase in tax credit. Can you get, Mr. Vice President, any kind of fillip or any real trigger in exploration and production with a 5% tax credit increase? I think it is minuscule, and the government needs to look at this again, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, even the report by Ernst & Young last year indicated that this minor change may not be viewed as sufficient. Even Ernst & Young recognized this was a minor change, Mr. Vice President. And we would say, on our side, that this is going to have absolutely no effect on exploration activity in this country. Mr. Vice President, please be reminded that the Petroleum Taxes Act, Section 26(1), is the credits that can be applied against the Supplemental Petroleum Tax. Mr. Vice President, the SPT, as it is abbreviated, is only applicable to oil production and condensate production, collectively referred to as liquids. SPT, Mr. Vice President, is not applicable to natural gas production. The industry, that is the energy industry, has been telling this government that the current SPT regime does not work in a low-price environment. The PNM, in its early incarnation in government, had promised, Mr. Vice President, to reform the SPT. But this fell by the wayside, as so many other things, that they had promised the population. So what we have here, Mr. Vice President, is not a comprehensive reform, which is what is required to resuscitate oil production in Trinidad and Tobago. What we have here as a measure is an attempt to tweak. That is, it is like a crumb they are throwing, Mr. Vice President, at the industry or to the industry. It will not work. But, Mr. Vice President, the government, as I told you earlier, is in a state of bazodi. They total bay. They suffer from malkadi. They don't know what hit them. And that is why we have all of these measures coming here. And it is not related to reality. Nothing will happen, Mr. Vice President, as a result of these measures. Nothing. So, Mr. Vice President, I want to tell you that the current SPT rate of 33% for marine oil production and 18% for land production will only be triggered when the oil price is beyond $50 a barrel. Mr. Vice President, I know that the EIA of the United States is now predicting, I think the oil price is around $58 now, and the price of gas is about $2.75. We are budgeted for $3 and also $60. And what is happening is that those numbers are in trouble. And Mr. Vice President, may I advise you that in Texas, a major oil find has taken place in which billions of barrels of oil will be coming onto the market shortly, which is going to have a debilitating impact on the prices of crude oil in the coming days, weeks, or months. So we are in trouble, Mr. Vice President, if we are dependent on oil to rescue us in this situation. So, Mr. Vice President, as I told you earlier, our oil has fallen very seriously, and the government is unable. They closed down Petrotrin, and they falsely promised the population that oil is going to be the answer, and we are going to be exporting oil and earning foreign exchange, Mr. Vice President. What has happened? Mr. Vice President, nothing has happened. What we have seen is that oil has fallen from 78,000 barrels to just under 58,000 barrels as at the end of September 2019. Let me deal with the capital allowance, Mr. Vice President, briefly. The reversion of the capital allowances for what is called developmental drilling, that is, Mr. Vice President, drilling into known reservoirs to a straight line 20% formula, is really a huge disincentive to the entire oil industry. This reverses the People's Partnership incentive package of April of 2014, which caused the investment in Juniper and Angeline to happen. They rode on the backs of our efforts at incentivizing the energy sector, and they got Juniper and Angeline. And Mr. Vice President, as we speak now, natural gas is going so. The Minister of Finance, as we saw in an article in the Business Guardian, was dead wrong, telling the country that we will get 3.8 billion standard cubic feet of gas per day. When we look at the review of the economy, it was just 3.6. And what is the reality for the first 9 months of this year? The average is 3.6. And there's a 98% correlation between natural gas production and the expansion of gross domestic product. So whenever natural gas production has contracted or is contracting, our GDP will automatically contract. And there's a declining level or rate of natural gas in the country. But we are being told by the Minister of Finance, fake news, false facts, that what? We will get 3.8 billion standard cubic feet of gas in 2019. Mr. Vice President, the average is 3.6. And that is why we are predicting, like the IMF and like Moody's, it will not be zero growth, you know. It will be minus growth in 2019 for this country. Nothing to be proud about. Nothing to be proud about. It is poor management. Bankrupt men and women in charge of our country. The time has come for them to go and rest. And let us take charge of this economy and get it working again for the people. That is what we have to do, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, this capital allowances. What this means is that the companies will recover their capital expenditure slower and not faster. But remember, Mr. Vice President, they always had the facility to recover 100%. All we did in 2014 was to speed it up to alter the time value of money. That is what we did. And therefore, this change, what is being proposed here, will change the net present value of investments in drilling projects and make TNT, that is our country, Trinidad and Tobago, less attractive. Mr. Vice President, we believe this is a negative step on the part of this government in this particular regard. Mr. Vice President, let me rush quickly to this matter of Clause 6. Mr. Vice President, I distinctly recall raising in this Parliament in 2017 the dichotomous situation based on the facts that were before us on the environmental tire tax. I told the minister in the Ministry of Finance that only foreign use tires were being taxed. They dismissed me. For 2 years, one sector of this economy was being punished. The poor, the vulnerable, the working people who using foreign use tires. They imposed a $20 on these people. 2 years later, confession is good for the soul. We are told by the minister they made an error. It was inadvertence. But I paid as a person who buying foreign use tires, $20, and tens of thousands of people pay this $20. You know what happened? All these people who are driving new brand cars and they're importing new brand tires, Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, they for 2 years, they pay a cent. And we are now going to correct that error. Now, are you going to make it retroactive for them to pay? Because I paid. That is the ordinary people paid. You see, Mr. Vice President, how this system is very unequal. You see the discrimination. You see the inequity in the system. That is why people have reached a point where they are going to toss this government into the Gulf of Paria after the next general election. We will never see the Minister of Foreign Affairs again in this Parliament after the next general election. Never. So, Mr. Vice President, I wanted to ask the Minister, in terms of Clause 6, is the Minister going to make this retroactive? What mechanism are we going to put in place to ensure that there's equity and justice and fair play? Why am I being called upon to pay $20 for a tire for the last 2 years, and people who can afford, people who have cars in this country, Mr. Vice President, whatever make it is, but it's a new car, they are able to afford those new cars. That's why they're buying them. If they couldn't afford them, they wouldn't buy them. But you know what? They did not allow them to pay. And I brought, Mr. Vice President, the former Senator, Danishwa Mahabir, he quoted all the customs notes and numbers and told the Minister in the Ministry of Finance, look, this thing is only applicable to foreign used tires. And Mr. Vice President, they did not listen to Danishwa Mahabir. They did not listen to Senator Wade Mark. They didn't listen to the opposition. 2 years later, they catch themselves. They catch themselves. And they say, no, happening? We make a mistake. We make a mistake. I believe the PNM is a mistake. The PNM is a mistake. The people made a mistake by voting the PNM in 2015. But I'm telling you one thing, they will correct that shortly. It's licks, and more licks in 2020. Mr. Vice President, I'm a very good predictor. I just prophesied. I told them before, bye-bye, bye-bye, bye-bye. I told them that in 2010 when I was here. And I told them, no, bye-bye, bye-bye, bye-bye. The end of y'all gone like the iguana. You know the iguana? Them gone like the iguana. Mr. Vice President, you will be the Vice President still, because I recommend that Nigel de Freitas remain. He's the only man who I'm going to propose remain in the chair. So I withdraw. Sir. I apologize too. I withdraw now.
I think you're well aware that you're not supposed to bring the chair into the debate. Continue.
I humbly apologize to the Honorable Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I want to indicate as well customs. Mr. Vice President, here what they try to do. Mama Guy the population. But Mr. Vice President, Mama Guy couldn't save them. It was licks and more licks. You know what they did, Mr. Vice President? They came in the 2020 budget. And what did they do? They increased personnel and household allowances from 3,000 to 5,000. Right? Mr. Vice President, I pass through the airport from time to time. The duty-free allowance for passengers who import gifts, as we were told at the airport, has been increased from 3,000 to 5,000. So a passenger, Mr. Vice President, can now import gifts to the value of 5,000 without paying duties once per year. That is in the regulation. Mr. Vice President, the minister who swiftly touched that and ran away didn't tell this Honorable Senate how this figure was arrived at. Were any studies done? Why not the equivalent of $1,000 US? We don't know, because we got no answers from the minister. Mr. Vice President, we would like to know the revenue foregone as a result of this measure. We are hearing about revenue leakages, and furthermore, we are supposed to be running on fumes. But you give away money because you hope to get votes. It's licks, and more licks. You ain't getting the votes. So, Mr. Vice President, we understand, based on our investigation, that there is absolutely no mechanism in place at customs to monitor this duty-free allowance of once per year. I would have thought, Mr. Vice President, that a mechanism would be put in place, and then this measure would have come into effect. Mr. Vice President, if you don't have a proper mechanism in place to monitor this thing, this process of increasing from 3,000 to 5,000 can lead to an abuse and thus eroding further the revenue base. Mr. Vice President, may I also remind you that in this country, when you arrive in this country and you fill out your form, as I do, there's a section after subsection 6 of that form which reads, 17 years and over are entitled, at that, well, now as we speak, 3,000 duty-free allowance on personal and household effect, not in commercial quantity, as well as 250 g tobacco or 250 grams of tobacco or cigarettes, not exceeding 200, or cigars, not exceeding 50, or cigarettes, not exceeding 100, and 1.5 liter of spirits or wine. Mr. Vice President, we passed a tobacco act. We passed an act here in this parliament not to serve children 18 years and under alcohol or cigarettes. But on our declaration form, we are being told that 17 years and over are entitled to the 3,000, which now goes to 5,000. And they're entitled to the spirits and wines and cigarettes. So there is a contradiction. The government doesn't know what it is doing. They implement a measure and they are allowing children under 18 years of age to buy alcohol at given the permission and the official sanction of the government of this country. This is something that we need to look at. We need to correct it. Either they amend this form, 18 and over. Cannot be 17 years and over when the law says 18 and over. Mr. Vice President, I don't want to take much of your time again. I think I've made my point. This is a totally failed administration. They have nothing to report on. We are going into the 5th and final year of their tenure. It has been only difficulty, challenges, brutality, punishment, terrorism, almost not them, Mr. Vice President, terrorizing the population virtually for the 5 years that they have been in office. This government, under this government, Mr. Vice President, wealth has been concentrated. More inequality of wealth and income in this country as we have never seen before. Mr. Vice President, with these few words, I thank you very much.
Senator C. Prasad.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for the opportunity to contribute to the debate on the Finance Bill 2019. Recognizing that the Finance Bill contains measures which are major drivers of economic activity in the country, it will be remiss of me if I didn't make the following observations on a few key matters. VAT refunds. The government currently owes businesses $5 billion in VAT refunds. While the initiative to deal with VAT refunds is welcomed, it is inadequate. The bonds, which are tradable and transferable, have a coupon rate of 1.5%. Under the law, if the government does not pay the company with the VAT refund due within 6 months, interest accrues at 1% per month. Since businesses will not benefit from this accrued interest, it means that only 80% of the potential VAT refund due will be actually paid. The small and medium-sized businesses will be most affected since larger businesses can withstand a longer waiting period. These businesses, which are compliant entities, are being penalized. Mr. Vice President, in fact, these businesses are in part funding government operations. The VAT owed to and accrued by businesses are idle assets. Instead, these assets should be in the hands of businesses which can put them to more productive use. The government should also review the interest rate on the VAT bonds since they are offering 4.5% on public bonds. Mr. Vice President, why are companies not allowed to net off VAT refunds against VAT payments due? I'm asking the Minister of Finance to treat this matter of the VAT refund bonds with great urgency. Collection of royalties by the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries. The function of the Ministry of Energy is to determine royalties payable to the government from companies and lease operators in the oil and gas sector, as well as those mining and processing minerals. I have looked at the 4th, 14th, and 20th reports of the Public Accounts Committee. These reports are titled Examination of the Report of the Auditor General on the Public Accounts of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago for the financial years 2014, 2016, and 2017, with specific reference to the Ministry of Energy and Energy Industries. From these reports, it is apparent that neither the Ministry nor independent inspectors verify the exchange points between buyer and seller, nor does the Ministry of Energy independently check the performance of meters. This means that oil and gas production data received from the companies used in the calculation of revenue collectible is not independently verified by the Ministry of Energy. It seems that the Ministry of Energy relies solely on data produced by the oil and gas companies to determine the royalties to be paid to Trinidad and Tobago. The same applies to the production extraction data from the operators of quarries, sand and gravel pits. The Ministry also does not have a system to capture data from all quarry operators, legal and illegal. Generally, information on the operations of illegal operators are supplied by members of the public. These significant deficiencies have been documented in the reports referenced. Mr. Vice President, I'm concerned that the country may not be receiving 100% of the royalties due from these resources. In this period of restrained economic activity, it is critical that all revenues from all sources are verified and collected accordingly. This must be addressed with urgency. Competitiveness and ease of doing business. Trinidad and Tobago is ranked 79th out of 144 countries in the 2019 Global Competitive Index report and 125th out of 190 countries in the 2019 World Bank Ease of Doing Business report. Clearly, meaningful reforms are necessary to significantly improve Trinidad and Tobago's competitiveness, which includes the ease of doing business. Facilitators of investors, both local and foreign, is imperative for economic growth and job creation. Consequently, there must be a reasonable level of local business activity. Consequently, there could be a reasonable level of local business activity, import substitution, and exports. To establish a more efficient business environment, public institutions must be overhauled. We need more proactive and predictable systems and policies. Transfers and subsidies. The country needs a plan to reduce the size of government and reliance on transfers and subsidies, including the divestment of state assets in a transparent and competitive way, and public-private partnerships for major capital projects. A diversification strategy to move Trinidad and Tobago away from the unsupportable dependence on carbons and to promote other economic activities such as alternative and renewable energy and the digital economy should be articulated. Some areas of diversification include the digital economy, renewable energy, carbon dioxide and enhanced oil recovery, and alternative energy usage. Incentive for the use of green delivery vehicles. Mr. Vice President, in rush hour traffic, one can observe the extent of fumes and other pollutants emanating from the many vehicles. To reduce Trinidad and Tobago's carbon footprint, the government has promoted the use of CNG and hybrid light motor vehicles. However, incentives can also be extended to promote the use of fuel-efficient commercial and delivery vehicles. The upfront costs are a barrier to companies acquiring these fuel-efficient vehicles. Consideration should be given to providing allowance or incentive so this becomes a viable option for businesses. In fact, the government can lead the way by getting rid of all the energy-consuming SUVs used by the various ministries, government and state agencies and replacing them with green vehicles. Dirty money. Dirty money is money on which tax is not paid to the government, and this informal economy is estimated to be 34% of GDP. This is not just income from crime, bribes, and undeclared real estate deals, for instance. It includes income from hundreds of small businesses, professionals, farmers, and self-employed persons who should be paying income tax, but who do not, because our tax collection suffers from weaknesses in tax administration, widespread tax evasion, and corruption within the public sector. We need to strengthen the country's tax capacity and improve governance in tax collection. National insurance. Under the current National Insurance Act, self-employed individuals fall within the definition of employed person and should be registered with the National Insurance Board and pay contributions. The Minister of Finance acknowledged this in his 2015 budget presentation and indicated there were no arrangements in place to govern the payment of contributions for or the payment of benefits to these individuals. He proposed to include self-employed individuals in the National Insurance Scheme effective January 1, 2016. However, to this date, it has not been done. I urge the Minister to deal with this matter so that self-employed persons can receive an NIS pension when they retire. I would also like to suggest that the Minister of Finance consider an amnesty for the payment of national insurance contributions. The National Insurance Fund is seriously underfunded vis-a-vis projected pension payments. There are numerous organizations in arrears with their national insurance contributions for various reasons or have failed to register their businesses in the specified time. The penalties to become compliant are prohibitive. An amnesty can lead to an increase in the contributor base, which will have a positive impact on the fund deficit. Income tax on pensions. Retirees on fixed income pensions should be exempted from income tax and probably all taxes. They have contributed during their productive working lives and have paid their dues. Paying taxes erodes their already small pensions. I hope some consideration will be given to these comments, observations, and suggestions. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Minister of Labour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. I am very pleased to rise this afternoon in this honorable House to make my contribution on the matter of the Finance Bill 2019. This bill, Mr. Vice President, as we are all aware, seeks to amend the Income Tax Act, Chapter 7501, the Corporation Tax Act, Chapter 7502, the Petroleum Taxes Act, Chapter 7504, the Customs Act, Chapter 7801, and the Cooperatives Act, Chapter 8103, which I propose to speak specifically upon as it falls under my portfolio as the Minister of Labor and Small Enterprise Development. Mr. Vice President, cooperatives have proven to be very, very valuable institutions for employment creation, wealth generation, and community development, especially in economically challenging times. It also assists those who are vulnerable or more vulnerable in our society. Cooperatives have existed in Trinidad and Tobago for more than a century and have assisted many families in achieving major goals such as educational development, home acquisition, savings, income security, and so much more. Mr. Vice President, I stand before this honorable House today as a product of the cooperative movement. I oftentimes say to my fellow cooperators when I have the honor and opportunity to address them that my whole life is a reflection of the philosophy that drives the cooperative sector, because everything I own, as little as I own, I don't own as much as my colleague, Senator Wade, Mark, and others. But the little that I own, I owe it to the cooperative and credit union sector. Mr. Vice President, currently there are 127 active credit unions and over 600,000 members who stand to benefit from this measure with an asset base of over $16 billion. We can recall, Mr. Vice President, the Minister of Finance in his 2020 national budget presentation pronouncing on these issues in the bill. In particular, the focus for me has to do with the cooperative movement. I am very proud, Mr. Vice President, to share that we at the Ministry of Labor and Small Enterprise Development, we fondly call ourselves Team Malsed, because the work of the ministry is not about the minister, but about teamwork in delivering the mandate of the ministry. From January 2016 to September 2019, we would have held 4 national consultations, which were primarily aimed at strengthening the the cooperative movement in Trinidad and Tobago. Emanating from these consultations, a major concern that rebounded time and time again during the discourse focused on Section 41 of the Cooperative Societies Act and the need for immediate review. This section, Mr. Vice President, provides for the beneficiary on the passing of their loved ones to obtain $5,000 without letters of administration. Mr. Vice President, the Minister of Finance, in announcing the new proposal to increase that amount of $5,000 to $50,000, did not pick a figure out of a hat, but that figure was informed by careful study. And I want to take the opportunity to put into the records, Mr. Vice President, the fact that the Ministry of Labor et al., through our cooperative division, looked at this issue, considered this issue. The commissioner, the acting commissioner of cooperatives, would have appointed a 3-person committee consisting of Ms. Heidi Bools, Legal Officer 1, Ms. Antonia White, Legal Officer 1, and Mr. David Moore, Cooperative Development Specialist. And they developed a position paper which was considered by the executive team at the ministry. And we would have conveyed our recommendation to the Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Finance, in March of this year. Mr. Vice President, I would want to share with this Honorable House the fact that we noted in particular the restrictions at Section 41, the restriction of limiting a member to $5,000 from the account of a deceased credit union member, even where the deceased member may have intended to leave the full amount. The deceased member may have had $100,000 in the account and intended to leave that full amount for his or her spouse. Even in that event, it was limited to $5,000. But there's a rationale for that, Because you see, Mr. Vice President, in 1971, when the CSA was enacted, the sum of $5,000 was considered a sizable amount and was thought that amount was really reasonable to handle funeral and related expenses in relation to a deceased member. However, Mr. Vice President, we are all aware that in light of the current economic circumstances, we recognize that $5,000 was no longer sufficient to cover the funeral expenses of a deceased member, and that once a beneficiary had been nominated, there should be no limit on the funds paid to the nominated beneficiary. It was proposed that the $5,000 restriction be removed and all the funds in the deceased member account be payable to the nominated beneficiary. There were two sides. There were pros and cons. One side of the coin said, listen, allow the members free flow. If it's $100,000, $200,000, then allow them to do so. But there was another school of thought, Mr. Vice President, that cautioned the committee and us at the level of the executive team. And some of the cautions were, one, that large sums of monies, if large sums of monies leave societies immediately upon the death of members, that could have a negative impact on the cash flow of those societies. Another consideration was that societies may now be open to litigation by the estate of deceased members, since large sums of monies are paid out, entitled persons may question the authenticity of the named nominee by seeking legal redress. Societies are now open to greater risk of employees defrauding the society to benefit themselves again, because large sums of monies are being paid out. We also considered the grant of probate and the letters of administration. They're subject to the due diligence of the probate registry of the High Court of Trinidad and Tobago, and that this process ensures that the correct parties receive monies owed. This duty of care will now fall on societies, which may give rise to legal action by parties who may have a standing to benefit from the estate of the deceased. So, Mr. Vice President, we looked at the pros and the cons, and we weighed them very carefully, and decided that it is only fair that the amount be increased while protecting societies. And therefore, by memorandum dated the 19th of March 2019, the Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Labor and Small Enterprise Development, would have communicated with the Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Finance, conveying to them the position of the Ministry of Labor and Small Enterprise Development, and I quote, "After careful consideration of the matter, the ministry proposes two alternative positions which may be considered. And they are: one, the limit imposed by Section 41 of the Cooperative Societies Act, Chapter 8103, ought to be removed entirely. Or two, the current limit of $5,000 be increased to $40,000. And as a consequence, therefore, Mr. Vice President, the Minister of Finance, in his consideration, announced that a new proposal to increase the amount from $5,000 to $50,000. This adjustment will ensure that beneficiaries can access the necessary funds to assist with funeral expenses, especially where the deceased was the breadwinner, thereby helping the family to keep their feet on solid ground while adjusting to life after the loss of a loved one. And Mr. Vice President, all of us in this chamber here, over the period of our lives, would have experienced losing a loved one. And not only does that impact on us, in a very physical way, but then to have the additional concern that I can only have $5,000. Where am I going to get the balance of the money to bury my loved ones? That, Mr. Vice President, is a concern that is no longer with the members of the cooperative movement. And I can say, Mr. Vice President, that this decision by the Minister of Finance has been embraced, welcomed with great happiness by everyone that I know belonging to the cooperative sector. I, too, am very happy about that. The Minister of Finance indicated that this measure will take effect on the 1st of January 2020. In relation to this proposal, it should be noted that currently Section 41(1) and 3 of the Cooperative Societies Act, that provision will still be in place, the $5,000 up to the 31st of this month, which is the 31st of December. Mr. Vice President, it is important to note that under the current law, all other monies due to the deceased member from the cooperative society shall be paid into his or her estate and be subjected to, in all respect, to the laws relating to inheritance of this country. It is this requirement that has been a burden to the average citizen who is a member of a cooperative society and has been unable in the past to access funds required to provide the deceased member with a proper funeral or to take care of necessary arrangements within a reasonable time frame. Mr. Vice President, the current legislation, the Cooperative Societies Act of 1971, our research reveals that the average cost of a funeral in this country at the lower end of the ladder approximate about $8,000, and at the higher end, it can go to $50,000 or more, depending on the financial position of the person or the family of the person who would have transitioned to the ancestors. Mr. Vice President, I would wish to highlight that if the benefit is increased, the named nominees will be able to access these funds immediately as 1st of January 2020 enters, and the balance at a later date upon the probate of letters. So that, Mr. Vice President, this this substantial increase will represent a great improvement in the way credit unions and other cooperative societies do business and provide relief for its members. It should be noted, Mr. Vice President, that this amendment to the Cooperative Societies Act, Chapter 8103, is but one of the important changes to this Act, Chapter 8103. The Ministry of Labor and Small Enterprise Development, as part of the labor legislative reform process, has identified that Cooperative Societies Act as one of the key pieces of legislation requiring review and amendment. To this end, as I indicated earlier, we would have held 4 consultations, and we are in the process of revising the national policy on cooperatives and developing a legislative policy for the amendment to this piece of legislation. These are all being undertaken in a highly consultative and participatory process because, Mr. Vice President, we believe that consultation is the bedrock of any good amendment or the development of any good piece of legislation. And therefore, despite the fact that we may be accused of consulting too much, I would point out that I would rather, as the Minister of Labor, be accused of consulting too much than not consulting at all. Because at the end of the day, any amendment that comes to this Honorable House or any legislation, I will bring it with the full confidence that all the stakeholders involved buy into what is being placed before this Honorable House and in the other place. We at the Ministry of Labor, Team Mull said, we believe and we act through the philosophy consultation, consultation, consultation. Mr. Vice President, these initiatives would further enhance the growth and development and sustainability of the cooperative movement. Mr. Vice President, you would have this Honorable House, the members of this Honorable House and your good self would have heard the Minister of Finance also made a pronouncement that the cooperative movement will be placed under an independent authority, reporting to the Minister of Finance. And as a consequence, therefore, we at the Ministry of Labor, moving in that direction, we are laying that foundation that would assist that process, because that independent authority, and there is agreement with the stakeholders from the cooperative movement for the establishment of this independent authority that would comprise members of their sector, members of the government, with an independent chairman. And Mr. Vice President, I would want to take the opportunity, my colleague is not here at the moment, he probably just stepped out, to thank my colleague, the Minister of Public Utilities, Senator, the Honorable Robert LaHunt, for heading this cabinet-appointed committee, and my colleague, Senator West, and my memory does not permit me to remember the Senator Gopiskun and Minister Hines formed that subcommittee of the cabinet where they met with the sector and arrived at certain recommendation which the cabinet accepted. And the document that came before the cabinet was entitled The Future Role of the Credit Union. And Mr. Vice President, two important aspects of that document that came to cabinet would have been the appointment, the establishment of that independent authority. And there was unanimous consensus that the board of directors of that new independent authority would report to the Ministry of Finance with equal numbers of persons representing the government and the sector, as I said before, with that independent chairman. In the meanwhile, we are focusing on the low-hanging fruits, that is institutional strengthening of the cooperative division of the ministry. Because you see, Mr. Vice President, the cooperative sector has literally exploded over the years. You would have heard me point out earlier that the sector has over 600,000 members with a base of $16 billion. We did an analysis of our cooperative division, and we recognize that there's need for institutional strengthening. There is need for the creation of certain positions that would facilitate credit unions, because we have requests from credit unions to invest $100 million. And therefore, in guiding these credit unions, we have to make sure that we have the correct level of professionals and staff in order to guide them in the right direction. And I am very pleased to share, Mr. Vice President, that in carrying out the instructions of the cabinet to meet with the central bank, Team Mull said, and met with the governor of the central bank and his team very recently, where we would have discussed this issue, and we have agreed on a framework in moving forward, so that I anticipate that over the next couple months, we would be seeing some rapid movements within the cooperative division, which would ultimately lead to Cabinet being asked to create certain positions pending the transition to this new independent authority in the very near future. So that, Mr. Vice President, as I close, I encourage all of us to continue to work together in achieving the goals of this nation. As we go into the festive season, I urge us all to do what we can to help those around us and to remember that we are each our brother's keepers. Mr. Vice President, I want to thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this debate. I thank you.
Senator Sobers.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for recognizing me this afternoon to contribute to this Finance Bill 2019. Now, I had a particular structure in place, but I would seek to treat with an issue that would have just arose based upon the Honorable Minister of Labor's contribution. Generally, when we, or members of the public, are aware that we are in this House or in the other place that we are going to discuss a bill as it pertains to finance, it has become the feeling of the people that they hear those words with a certain degree of fear and trepidation, because they believe that more than likely it is some measure to tax the population. And it would have been a very difficult task sometimes in explaining to members of the public that no, not every single finance bill that comes to the House has to deal with tax. But to be honest, you really can't blame the population. Unfortunately, they've grown accustomed to that type of relationship with this particular administration. And it resounded to what actually transpired last week, Monday, when the public sent a proper message to the government that they are in no way in agreement with respect to how these measures are being meted out to them. But as it pertains to what was raised by the Honorable Minister of Labor, she touched on Clause 8 of the bill. So I will go directly to Clause 8 because Clause 8 deals with this amendment to the Cooperative Societies Act. Now, simply it deals with this increase of money payable to a nominee or a legal personal representative of a deceased member. And that is where I want the public to really understand what the Act is really going to say or what it does. I can, in fact, understand and appreciate that many persons, when they lose a loved one, how traumatic the situation and the circumstances could, in fact, be. And in some instances where there are no monies available to treat with burial and funeral expenses, and the individual is aware that the deceased person may have had some funds within a cooperative society or credit union, that the usage of those funds at that point in time would be very, very much a welcome position. The way in which the law currently stands or operates with respect to administering deceased persons' property is quite clear. And I think it has not been said enough, or it hasn't been said at all, how such situations occur. You generally hear persons talking on the street that they need to get some letter of administration or some probate document, or the document in probate and it taking too many years and I can't access this and I can't access that and it tie up on it, all sorts of things. And then they just want to blame the lawyer and then blame the court and all sorts of foolishness for why the estate or the administration of the estate is not moving as it's supposed to. So that when persons are now hearing that
really and truly, without such document being in their possession, they would now be able to access monies within a cooperative or credit union. They will say, well, hey, this is a good thing. And where the ceiling for such funds is being raised from $5,000 to $50,000, why not? The problem with that is this. In terms of understanding, when someone passes, you either pass having already prepared and left a will, which would mean then that you would have died as a testator, or you die without having done a will, which would mean then that you died intestate. That's as simple as it could get. I think everyone who's listening or who's watching would know what a will is. It's a document that you would basically indicate what your possessions are and who you intend to leave it for, and you would have a witness, 2 witnesses, and so you do the document whether by a lawyer or by yourself, and that is your will, which could be changed at any point in time. And then for those persons who, for whatever reason, may have never gotten the opportunity to so do a document of that nature, they die intestate. And we have the Administration of Estates Act, which would deal with something called the Rules of Intestacy. It outlines the persons who are your next of kin, your immediate relatives then, who would be able to claim your assets based upon these rules. So the rules would stipulate then that the spouse of a deceased person would be the first in line to claim, and then it would go on to children and parents, and then brothers and sisters of the whole blood and half blood, and it goes on and on and on, to as far low down as nephews and nieces and whatnot, right? But the reason why the Administration of Estates Act is set up like that is because the law contemplates a particular number of situations then where persons who may have been closely related to a deceased person should be allowed to administer their estate. And what the Cooperative Society Act states at Section 41 is that where a person has been nominated as beneficiary by a member in accordance with the bylaws of a society, and such nominee is admitted to membership in the society shall, within 1 year of the death of the member by whom the nomination was made, transfer the shares or interests of such deceased member, subject to the limit specified in subsection 3, which currently stands at $5,000 to the nominee. This is the interesting part. So in terms of a person being a nominee, usually when you open up an account at a credit union, you would indicate who is the benefit or the beneficiary of the funds in the account. But when you read on, where, however, such nominee is not admitted to membership in a society, or where the deceased member made no such nomination, the society shall, within 1 year of the death of such deceased member, pay to the nominee or legal personal representative of the deceased member, as the case may be, such sum not exceeding the said limit representing the value or part thereof of deceased member's shares or interest in the society. Many persons who open up accounts in credit unions and cooperative societies, for whatever reason, may not name a beneficiary. So there's no named nominee associated with the account, save and except to the account holder, who may very well be deceased in this particular instance. Well, has to be deceased. And what you would have is persons who may very well be related to the deceased person, who aren't named beneficiaries or aren't named nominees according to this act, going into the cooperative society or the credit union and asking for the funds within the account. Now, the general position of the union, the credit union or the cooperative society is to say, listen, you need to go and get a letters of administration or grant of probate if there was a will to access the funds in the account. But we are able now to give you $5,000. Now, for me, the first time that this occurred for me in practice was wherein an individual came to me, told me that her husband had passed away, and she wanted to do up the letters of administration for the husband's assets because he left no will. So I said, no problem. I asked for certain documentation. She brought it in. And when I started to prepare the inventory, which is a list of the assets of the estate itself for the deceased individual, I noticed that there was a credit union account. And she indicated to me, oh yeah, well, I already went into the credit union. I know that the credit union, the monies in the union is about $25,000, but they gave me $5,000. So I said, okay, well, that's a little bit strange. How did you come to get that money from the credit union? Well, I told him, well, I am his wife, and I want the money in the account. So I said, well, what documents did you present? Just the death certificate. I said, did they ask you for the marriage certificate? No. And on the death certificate, she is named as the informant to the death certificate. So based upon that, they said that she's the LPR, and they gave her the funds in the account, the $5,000. Now, I mean, to any lawyer, no name beneficiary. And the law prescribes it for that, right? And that is what I'm saying. You see, so there's the fly in the ointment. You are a person who is not named as the beneficiary, presenting these documents to the credit union, and they're giving you this $5,000. Right? No, I mean, in that case, she was the wife of the deceased person. But what if it is someone else? Being an informant on a death certificate is not a difficult task to achieve. Any Tom Jones who goes to the police and tells them, well, listen, X was in the house or whatever, you're living next door to the person, or you're living within the home of the person like that, you could be, of course, yes.
Mr. Vice President, I would just like to put into the records that that scenario really is not the norm. When you go, you have to present your marriage certificate and a death certificate. So someone made an error within that credit union.
And I'm grateful for that. But even in such a situation, Honorable Minister, you are the wife. So you do in fact present a marriage certificate and a death certificate. But let's say your husband had a will, and you weren't aware that he had a will. So you were operating under the premise then that we'll go with letters of administration, because I know my husband doesn't have a will. But this time, and I'm just saying ex-person, right? This time, ex-person's deceased husband had a will wherein he named his outside woman the person who will get all the money. Right? No, I said someone. I can't know aspersion on anybody, right? Outside woman or right? So he names his outside woman the person who will receive all the money in that particular account at the cooperative society or the credit union. And for his wife, he leaves everything else, the beautiful house and the lovely car and monies in the other bank accounts and whatnot. But that particular amount of money in the cooperative society, he's left for this outside character. What would happen to the individual then? You would have a situation where you would have the letters of administration going before the registry to be vetted. And then you would have the outside woman or the individual who on the outside. Who, I mean, and you see, the thing is this, Mr. Vice President, I intend in no way to be facetious, because I would have dealt with a particular matter along those lines, where a person would have passed away in a home. He was living with a particular individual. He was a bit estranged from some relatives that he had, and he had a will that he gave to those relatives. This particular woman lived with him, she cohabited with him from time to time, not according to the Cohabitation Act. And that particular woman, when the gentleman passed away, ran to the police station, became the informant on the death certificate, and then went and started to access certain monies the gentleman had in Cooperative Societies account. And then also would have gone to an attorney and started the process for letters of administration, right? And there was a valid will in place to treat with this particular gentleman. And this is why, in terms of how it is structured now, to now increase that ceiling, that limit now to $50,000, you could imagine the types of activities we could have here with such a ceiling being raised. Now, I could appreciate, as I said when I began, how difficult it would be when someone dies and you would want to have monies to treat with funeral expenses and whatnot. But I know in terms of the national insurance, you could procure monies from the national insurance for burial as well too, right? To assist with respect to offsetting under $7,000. And I'm thinking then, why don't we then equate, if we are raising the limit, to equate it to the same $7,000 that is available in the national insurance to help prevent any unwanted access of funds within the cooperative society. I do appreciate that it takes a long period of time for persons to possibly procure the grant of letters of administration and a grant of probate from the registry in the High Court. It takes a long time. Sometimes it takes years because there are documents that have to be vetted. There will be documents that have to be done over, signatures missing. Sometimes the queries that come out from the registry itself are quite frustrating. And I know in terms of the system there, they've now started to send out the queries itself via email to the lawyers. The lawyers have records and whatnot there. Before, you had to send a clerk to Port of Spain ever so often to check your file as an attorney to determine whether or not you had any queries there. It used to take months. It still takes quite some time. But in terms of interfering with this particular section and raising the ceiling, you could actually be opening up yourself to a can of worms with respect to the types of persons that may be going out there to fleece these credit unions of this money and really disinherit the persons who are actually entitled to these sums of monies. Because I don't believe that the credit unions do the types of checks that they need to before issuing these funds. Having dealt with positions like that as an attorney in practice as well too. So I just wanted to put that on the record. Yes. Now, also when I looked at the bill itself, I looked at Clause 3 in particular. And Clause 3 dealt with the Income Tax Act as it pertains to this solar water heater situation. Now, I think in terms of encouraging persons to utilize solar water heaters instead of the normal electric heaters is in fact a welcomed approach. My only issue is that I'm wondering in terms of the rollout of such a situation, what has really and truly been done by the government to ensure that persons aggressively approach this situation or aggressively adopt the use of solar water heaters. This comes in tandem with other things that would have come out of the budget presentation earlier this term with respect to the LED bulbs and whatnot. And all of these things go into energy saving and the type of the use that we would have from natural gas in terms of saving on energy and funneling it to downstream industries in Point Lisas and whatnot, so that we would be able to export more lucrative refined products such as urea and whatnot. And I am all for that. Because again, as I said in my budget presentation, it isn't something new, it's not something novel. This was actually started by a People's Partnership Administration in 2010 or 2011. We were the ones to come first with respect to solar water heaters in terms of energy saving and tax saving measures. We were the ones to come first with respect to LED bulbs. It is still on the record. No one has disproved that, that submission. As try as they may like, they've not stood up and said that it was not true. They claim they looked for the documents high and low, right? But they couldn't find anything, and I offered to send them the documentation so they would be able to utilize it to continue the work that we would have done as well too.
Probably need to give them a ball.
But well, I don't know if that would help you. But in terms of picking up where we have left off, what have you done since 2010, 2011? What matriculation have you used to measure the efficacy of measures, these particular measures that you intend to roll out? You've came to the Parliament in terms of 2015, 2016 with respect to rolling out hybrid vehicles and CNG vehicles. But how many persons, apart from just purchasing the hybrid vehicles because they came out to be a bit cheaper, understand the benefit that is accrued to society environmentally by using hybrid vehicles and utilizing CNG vehicles? In terms of leading by example as a government and an administration, how many state vehicles and state enterprises and state entities are now hybrid or are CNG used vehicles or vehicles that use CNG? In terms of the HDC projects that they would have indicated they intend to use solar water heaters and whatnot, how many HDC projects that have started actually utilize? Well, this is the thing. So they not some of the houses that are being constructed in the first place. You know, we would question whether or not the person should be living there in the first place or not, right? With our brothers and sisters in Moruga. And then in terms of speaking about putting solar water heaters within these units, how many HDC projects actually utilize these solar water heaters, right? how many of these HEC projects that have taken off the ground actually now would use these LED bulbs. We haven't gotten any information to demonstrate that the government is actually leading by example. And then in terms of what we intend or hope to procure from moving to these energy-saving methods, what alternative industries have created, or the genesis of alternative industries have come alive based upon these measures. I know in terms of comparison, right here within the Caribbean, we could look to Barbados, who has used a lot of these solar water heating instruments within their homes. At a point in time, I am aware that Barbados was third per capita in the world for solar water heaters. They actually have an industry where they create these solar water heaters. And as a matter of fact, the Bajan government would have implemented penalties for the importation of electric water heaters to ensure that the citizens make that environmentally conscious choice to adopt the use of solar water heaters. But we have not seen that in terms of any measures being meted out by this particular administration. So it appears then again, as we have been saying constantly, it is always a piecemeal approach to treating with things, a constant fumbling and thudding in the dark. And there's no, and as much as we talk about energy and light bulbs, it doesn't seem that the lights are home in the PNM administration. Because when last I was here in terms of treating with this particular issue, I indicated to the government the way in which education and awareness would have gone a very long way with respect to rolling out the LED bulbs under our tenure, under the People's Partnership Administration. And I would have thought that my friends opposite would have utilized some of that information in terms of their rolling out. But obviously, based upon certain, so that the only thing that I guess my friends on the other side would have taken from that was to run down to Faizabad and light up the streets down there, as opposed to lighting up the rest of the country, right? And what my friends have to understand on the other side is that lighting up part of a country during an election period will not win you any election points. Because all you benefited from that was a proper sound curtail that sent you back up the road packing. Right? So this is what I'm getting at, that, you know, in terms of education, it is clearly lacking. And Mr. Vice President, if you would allow me, when our leader would have ventured into the other place and would have dealt with respect to the National Economic Transformation Plan 2020 to 2025, she dealt with issues regarding energy and energy-saving measures. She outlined the UNC's commitment to ensuring sustainable energy future for Trinidad and Tobago by strategic transformation of the energy matrix of our country. She indicated in no uncertain terms that the world is approaching a point where fossil fuels, oil and gas and coal are becoming depleted amidst increasing concerns about climate change and environmental destruction, and indicated then, Mr. Vice President, the establishment of plans that we intend to roll out once the public gives us another opportunity at governing this country, which is very soon on the horizons, right? That we intend to establish a solar tech park with the Tamina in Tech Park, that the solar tech park would develop energy-efficient modular solar solutions which can be retrofitted to existing buildings or integrated into new construction projects and used in several other areas such as marine communication and transport, right? Should have gone on to indicate all public institutions would be mandated to purchase electric vehicles for their fleets. A pilot project would be started with the PTS fleet and then extended to Wassa, Tiantek, and TT Posts, right? And that is leading by example, right? That project provide incentives for the private sector to use solar energy charging stations for electric vehicles, install solar carports, repurpose electric vehicle batteries beyond their useful life. And she went on to name many other things in terms of public housing developments built by the HDC or other government agencies will be outfitted with renewable energy technologies. And you know, talk about also street lighting and new public housing developments with solar and or wind powered. And it goes to show in terms of when we present viable plans, we actually have a lot of thought involved in those plans. And because everything that we do in terms of our presentation to this particular country is always with the people in mind and a proper future for the persons within our country. So I would have definitely liked to see a lot more, instead of just saying, well, listen, we're just going to give tax incentives. I mean, I understand. I got an education today in terms of what was put on the record by the Honorable Minister and the Ministry of Finance with respect to the tax incentive. And again, it is a welcome approach, but more needs to be done. And I thought at this stage, 2 months onwards from the budget, we would have been getting a comprehensive report as to how the government would have intended to roll these things out and what they would have done thus far. Now, I also looked briefly at Clause 7 of the bill itself. And, yes.
Second. Honourable Senators, it is now 4:20, and I think we'll take the tea break. We shall return at 5 p.m. This House will now stand suspended until 5 p.m.